Part 5. The Laws of Creation. The True Boundaries of the Self. Conversation with Lucifer. When reading channeled messages, remember no external information is 100% reliable. Listen, first and foremost, to yourself. All the information is already within each of us. Tell me how duality came to be. Separation. It began with the division of God outside of God. A part of God separated itself from God like an island and stood opposite God so that he could perceive this separated part. But by separating as an island of God, this part began to delve deeper into its own center. And the further it moved into its center, the more it distanced itself from the true God, the more it forgot its connection to God, and the more it began to perceive itself as independent. This was the primary illusion of separation. A creature living in the depths of the ocean does not know that beyond the surface of the ocean there is the light of the sun. And the deeper it sinks into the ocean's abyss, the less pure light reaches it, and the more it seems that there is no sun only the ocean. You said that the further a being moved into itself, the more it lost its connection to God. But we often believe that by going inward, we find God there. This is a linear perception. When the particle of God began to immerse itself and move away from the true God, it began to create and unfold entire worlds within itself, as it initially possessed all the qualities of the Creator. These unfolded worlds within it became its external reality, while the points of contact between the particle of God and God became its internal points of connection. Everything was reflected in reverse. First inward, then outward from within. The creation of space lies in the unfolding of a point of potential. There is a particle of God, like an island of God. It moves deeper into itself and unfolds its creations and spaces within itself. This is the very inversion that is often spoken of. By unfolding the spaces it creates within itself, the particle of God unfolds the points of creative potential, and thus the inversion of space occurs from outside God into the interior of the particle of God. And the boundary of contact with God folds into the inner space. That is, what is created by the particle of God becomes the external cosmos, external relative to God, because it is a part of God outside of God. And the part of the particle of God that touches God, the boundary with God, becomes the inner cosmos, as it is the true God himself. This is very confusing. What happened next? Next, the particle of God began to separate islands of itself, which stood opposite it, so that it could contemplate and perceive them. And so the second degree of separation arose. The first, as you remember, was the separation of the particle of God outside of God so that he could contemplate it. The second was the separation of a part of the particle of God outside of this particle so that it could contemplate this part of itself, and so on infinitely. But then it turns out that God can only contemplate a part of the particle of God through this particle of God. Correct. And this is precisely why God cannot directly influence the part of the particle of God only through this particle. And this is the law of free will. How is this free will if God simply cannot influence this part? Think about it. This is how cause and effect were born. That is, the part of the particle of God became the effect, and the particle of God was the cause of this part's emergence. And God could only contemplate parts of himself through the prism of these parts, and this is the reflection and movement of divine light inward. Everything is similar. You said that a part of God separated outside of God. Was this part you? Are we all parts of your particle? Yes, that is so. But alongside you, other parts of God also separated, and this was what is called the rebellion of the angels. Did these parts of God also unfold their worlds within themselves? Yes, the universe is diverse. They created other worlds and systems in their own image and likeness. Do these worlds intersect? Everything that has similarity intersects. If you are a millionth reflection of me, then what is your degree of similarity with a millionth reflection of another creator? Understand? He and I are particles of God, and in this we are similar. But then we began to create worlds within ourselves in our own likeness. In our own likeness means from ourselves and within ourselves. But the creative impulses are different. Just as one artist's painting is unlike another's so too is the degree of similarity between our creations different. You have realist artists who try to reflect what they see traditionally. But then cubists and impressionists appear, and other paintings and creations emerge. This is the prism of reflection. How similar is Malevich's square to the world around you? But what does free will consist of? In the ability to create, and in separation. The true God separated parts of himself outside of himself and gave them the ability to also create parts of themselves, granting them the freedom of creation. He also realized that if he were to interfere in the creation of his parts, the impulse of his interference would reach the point of intervention distorted, as it would pass through the path of distortions. And God understood that his interference would not be as he intended, and so the law of non-interference was born. These two laws, cause and effect and free will, are interconnected. We perceive this as a kind of gift, but it turns out it's just a necessary measure. A gift is something given without requiring anything in return. Is this not God's gift to you and all your parts? All right, how did duality arise? Light and dark, up and down, man and woman. Don't rush. I'm trying to explain this to you. There are many more conversations ahead. Creation formed the laws of creation, and the law of similarity emerged. Nothing is like anything else, since everything is a distortion. And everything is like everything else, as it has a single source and a single essence. If everything is God, then everything is similar. But there are differences in similarity. And the particles of God began to interact based on their degree of similarity. And so the poles of similarity began to arise. Look, at the boundary with God, the particle of God is similar to God, but the deeper it moves into its center through its creations, the more this similarity is distorted. These are the first two poles of similarity or duality, I and God. The second pair of duality poles, I and a part of me, and so on. But the parts of me within me are also different, and their creations are different. What about male and female? How did this distinction arise? In the same way, some parts of God restructured their prisms of perceiving God into a certain degree of refraction of his light, and the degrees of creation differed. Passive and active degrees of creation. What does this mean? I'm searching for words within you. What is active creation? It is the creation of something whose degree of similarity to you is low, that is, something more different from you, more distorted, and accordingly, passive creation is the creation of something close and similar to you. At the same time, this is a kind of scope of creation. That is, you can create by immersing yourself inward or by moving outward from yourself. Don't try to understand this linearly. Learn to think multidimensionally. To avoid confusion, Let's define that the distinction of self is closeness to God, that boundary with God that is inside you. The further you move away from God in your creations, the more actively you create, the more you create by expanding yourself outward. The less you move away from God, the more you immerse yourself inward in your creation, and the more passively you create. But all this is conditional, as it all happens within you. In the active part of creation, you simply unfold, invert a part of yourself outward within yourself. Those who read our conversations write that this is all very convoluted. Don't think about others. Try to understand and remember for yourself. Those who wish to understand will understand and realize. Look, the more you create, the more diverse creations arise within you. Some of them are active, and some are passive creations. And by the law of similarity, they polarize, that is, like attracts like. And so two poles form within you, the pole of active creation and the pole of passive creation. And depending on which of your creations predominate within you, your belonging to the male or female type of perception is determined. You have a concept, unity as the struggle of opposites. Replace the word struggle with interaction, and you will get the correct reflection. But why did opposition arise? Male energy as active energy initiated this opposition. Active creation is a greater degree of distance from God. The greater the degree of distance, the greater the illusion of separation. Those parts of the particles of God that began to create actively and move further away from God unfolded themselves into external worlds. And the more they unfolded themselves outward, the further they moved from God, the more they perceived themselves as separate, and the more they perceived their external worlds as reality. And so they began to consider the boundaries of their created external worlds as the true boundaries of themselves. And then they decided that they were defined not by their internal boundaries with the true God, but by their external boundaries, the boundaries with the world external to them. Look, your physical body and the external reality you perceive are your active creation. And you begin to perceive the boundaries of yourself as the contour of your physical body, and begin to fight for your physical inviolability. But you do not realize that these boundaries are an illusion. Your true boundary is the one separating you from God, and it lies within you. And if you unfold your creation inward, you will begin to return to God within yourself, creating other wondrous worlds along the way. And this is passive creation. But we all actively create external, perceived worlds. Does that mean we are all men? You are speaking of the physical body. When you wake up every morning and create the world you perceive within a part of yourself, you are creating actively and moving away from the true boundaries of yourself, feeling your separation from God. And many of you become so engrossed in this external creation of yourselves that you consider it the boundary of your true self. But when you return within yourself to God, to me, to Kuthumi, to all your parts within yourself, you interact with us through the true boundaries of yourself, what separates you from the true God, and then you create passively. So everything I see around me is my external creation of myself, and everything I feel inside is my internal creation of myself. And then you are also my internal creation. You could say that. So, what yogis see when traveling through astral worlds is simply their internal creation, and it doesn't really exist. We have already spoken about what reality is. Reality is what you perceive. If you perceive one visible reality, it exists for you exactly as it is. If you become a multidimensional being and begin to perceive several realities simultaneously or in sequence, they all exist precisely at the moment you perceive them. If you perceive several realities at once, they all exist simultaneously for you. What another person perceives also exists, but only when you perceive it. Therefore, there is no point in arguing who is right. Each of you is right because what they perceive necessarily exists. That reality exists because they create it. Perception is creation. Understand?